So only 10% of the customers have been engaging with the process in reference to only 10% of customers responding to attempts to contact them.
That is the brief the department sent me, correct?
And is this right? The effect of the process was that if the customers did not respond, or I should say recipients of Social Security did not respond, they would have their entitlements calculated using averaged ATO data.
That is my understanding, yes.
I'm next going to ask you about paragraph 50 of your statement. You say, you refer to your first month of your second term as minister. When you say second term as minister, that's as Minister for Human Services. In reference to the fact that you'd previously been the minister for that department in an earlier year.
For a short period, correct.
Thank you. And when you say the first month of that second term, is that a reference to effectively June 2019?
It is. So if you think through the sequence, the 27th of May, I sit down with the Secretary Leon for 55 minutes, the normal welcome minister, welcome secretary, talk me through the issues. The Blue Book comes along. In the early June, there was brief 119, which is legal in confidence, to talk about all the issues with the scheme. Cabinet in confidence brief 120 that goes through where the scheme's up to and its architecture. And at this point, having just come from Treasury and having done over 30 bits of ledge in 9 months and very attuned to how Treasury works, reading through it all, it became fairly obvious to my team and I that how Treasury works is fundamentally different to how Social Security works. And trying to pair the two is always going to be incredibly difficult.
Right. Well, you say that in this time you started to entertain doubts that the use of ATO averaged income data may not be sufficient to support the raising of a debt and that further investigations were needed.
Correct.
And you say that that was because social welfare payments were calculated on a fortnightly basis, whereas ATO data was annual.
Correct.
And you refer to your time as in the past as Assistant Treasurer, and that on that basis you were very familiar with the type of data the ATO would have had capacity to share.
Exceptionally familiar. Also being responsible for tech at the time, very aware of it. I used to use an example with my staff. We started doing this in defence when to solve problems you'd pick the left and right of arc of a problem and inflate it. And if those two held true, the centre will generally hold. So in this case, I'd often give an example where if for 25 fortnights of the year you earned nothing, but the 26th fortnight you earned $1 million. It's a somewhat ridiculous example, but it's illustrative. Well, in that case, you are entitled to welfare for 25 fortnights, but for the last fortnight you are not. But if you average it, the ATO will go, well, you earned $1 million in the year, therefore your taxable income is X. Quite rightly, based on a sliding tax scale. But that data, when it comes across to social services, would say ostensibly you earned over $30,000 a fortnight. That's the effective averaging. So taking a difficult example like that and pulling it across shows very clearly this can't work. A better example might be a student who works over Christmas and then doesn't work during a period. But the more obtuse example highlights the issue of what happens when you use tax data.
That obtuse example is an example which you subsequently used, according to you in your statement.
I used it often with my staff, because my point in June, before I went on leave, was to say unless we can answer this question, we can't answer the question on how ATO data is used.
All right. And you went on annual leave from the 15th of June 2019 until the 22nd of June 2019?
That's correct. And I wanted a deep dive on the issue when I got back, because brief 119, which was legal in confidence, had outlined a range of issues that we were facing in terms of litigation. On the 27th of May, when Secretary Leon and I sat down, the very first meeting, she made the point that Robodebt was going well, her words, but there was a litigation issue. She said it had been mostly solved, but it may require some further advice and it may require some changes. So then I get brief 119, legal in confidence. I get a cabinet in confidence brief, which is quite extraordinary if you think as to why you'd put a brief as cabinet in confidence when I'm not working into cabinet on anything substantive. And at that point, we started going, we need to look at this.
Okay. So just to put this in the sequence, you received a brief which is behind your tab 13, doc ID CTH.0009.001.2893, Exhibit 6075.
Yes, brief 119, that's right. So well, the first was the discussion with Secretary Leon, second was the Blue Book. This would be this or brief 120, I forget which came first, but they're the next two substantive pieces on this topic.
Okay, and we can see on page 2 of that brief, paragraphs 8 and 9, reference to report of the matter to the Office of Legal Services Coordination, informing of the Solicitor General, close liaison of the Department with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Department of Social Services.
As you'd expect for any significant litigation the department's facing.
Sure. And then there's a note in paragraph 9 about the potential implications of the litigation if the federal court makes a decision adverse to the position of averaging.
Correct. And then notes, of course, brief 120 refers on a detailed briefing on the budget measures, which is the other one I referred to.
Yes. Now, you, is it your handwritten notations under the words Minister comments on the box on the first page?
Yes, have DepSec briefed me on the first week of July, i.e. this is now really serious. Not only am I concerned, but the brief from the department saying that it is so serious that the normal way that significant matters are referred has been referred, and if there is an adverse judgment, well, it's going to have significant implications for the government.
Okay. And the deep dive session occurred on the 4th of July 2019?
That's correct.
And may we take it that your recollection of who was present at that session is as appears in paragraph 56 of your statement?
That is correct. That'll be drawn from the meeting invite in my diary.
Okay. And do you have a recollection of the Chief Counsel of the department, Mr. French, being at that session?
No, but the DepSec is entitled to bring whatever supporting staff they want, and it was quite common for a cast of thousands to turn up to these.
Okay. So is it possible that although you don't have a recollection of that being the case, that Mr. French was there, that in fact he may well have been?
Entirely possible.
Okay. And in paragraph 57 of your statement, is this right? You recount that you articulated to representatives of DHS your obtuse example that you described to us earlier regarding problems with averaging.
I wouldn't have used the word obtuse. I simply used it to you to give an idea of what I was thinking, but yes.
Sure, I wasn't purporting to suggest you use the word obtuse. It was just an easy way to refer back to what you said. And you say, paragraph 58, that you asked during this session whether there was any existing legal advice on the issue of use of ATO averaged income data, and you say that you were told no.
Correct.
You say that you wanted to know and ask those present whether the use of other data types could be utilised to improve the process. That's what you say at paragraph 59?
That is correct. So brief 119, which we referred to previously, indicated that if there are losses, well, there are substantial, as in if the federal court matter is lost, there'll need to be substantial changes to the design of the scheme. The same conversation, of course, was had on the 27th of May, where the Secretary was saying that some matters had arisen that may seem some design changes. Well, if that's the case, then let's have a conversation about what those design changes may be.
Okay. And then you describe what your state of mind was having heard the presentation at paragraph 60 of your statement, which is, you say you then held a strong personal view that the sole use of ATO averaged income data was insufficient to raise a debt. but was unsure if the partial use of ATO averaged income data was sufficient to raise a debt. For that reason, you decided that the next step to progress the issue was to obtain legal advice.
Yes, there would have been a discussion about it in terms of my staff unable to answer my obtuse, without using those words, example. My recollection is that there was little pushback in the room. Everyone agreed that we needed to get advice.
I don't want to be pedantic, but I'm not sure obtuse is the word you want. You mean extreme or exaggerated, don't you?
Yes, ma'am, that is a better choice of words.
Okay, thank you.
And it's your evidence, is it, as described in paragraph 61, that at the conclusion of the session you requested DHS seek a legal opinion from the Australian Government Solicitor?
That is correct. Might have said the Solicitor General, I can't recall, but I wanted some legal advice as to where we are, to the point where if I was right, and we'd sort of all come to the point now that we needed some legal advice, I can't walk into a cabinet room and say there needs to be changes without the highest level of legal advice in the land saying that's the case.
Okay. Are you now aware that, in fact, at that time the department had in its possession a draft advice provided by the Australian Government Solicitor on prospects in the Masterton matter?
I've been so advised.
And that that advice dealt with the lawfulness of the use of averaging to calculate social security entitlement?
I've been advised that, correct?
Have you had an opportunity in preparation for your evidence today to review that draft advice?
I have not.
In your volume 2, Mr. Robert, tab 118, is a copy of that draft advice. It's exhibit 6314, doc ID CTH.3007.0023.8028. Have that?
In front of me? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, do you agree with me that would appear to be a draft advice from the Australian Government Solicitor dated the 27th of March 2019?
Yes.
And if you go to page 2, first bullet point, at the top of the page, and for context, the words commencing at the bottom of the previous page says in relation to the bullet points that follow that the applicant presently has, and then in relation to that, or in that bullet point says good prospects of succeeding on the basis that apportioned ATO PAYG data does not establish that the applicant owes a debt under section, and it gives a section of the relevant legislation.
I see that.
And then if we go to page 11, in fact, if we start with page 10, you can see the heading apportionment as evidence of the existence of a debt under section 1223. See that?
I do.
And that you can see in paragraph 38, the paragraph commencing PAYG data has known limitations. See that?
Yes.
And then paragraph 39 talks about various inherent limitations with apportionment. To the effect that apportionment, which is being used here in this context as another word for averaging, produces inaccurate calculation of debts. Do you agree with me on that?
I do.
And then the point is made in paragraph 41 on page 11 that if apportionment does not produce an accurate assessment of a person's actual fortnightly income, then it does not provide evidence on its own that a person has received a benefit to which they are entitled so as to give rise to a debt under section 1223. You see that?
I do.
Now,
And can we add, there's no statutory basis in the Act for deeming apportioned income to be accurate or to be a basis on which to raise a debt?
I agree, Commissioner. I'm a prolific Act reader.
okay. Now, appreciating this was in draft form, do you accept that it reflected the views of the authors of the document as at the date that it purports to be dated, that is the 27th of March 2019?
Yes.
Thank you. And on your evidence is that you weren't informed of the existence of this advice at the deep dive session on 4 July 2019?
If I can take you back, Mr Scott, if I may.
Sure.
This wasn't told to me by the Secretary on the 27th. It wasn't in the Blue Book. It wasn't in Brief 119, which covered all the legal aspects. It wasn't attached to, nor referred to, nor inferred of in Cabinet in Conference Brief 120. So on the 4th of July, what I'm hearing and seeing from you is that my department had an AGS brief, and they've now had it for 27th of March. Is that the date, sir?
Yes.
They've now had it for March, April, May, June. They've now had it for almost 100 days and have not informed me in writing in any way, shape or form. I do not recall this being briefed to me. I don't recall my department saying on the 4th of July, we have an AGS advice, because if we did, my actions would have been consistent with what I did on the 7th of November when the SG advice arrived. My department had had it for 7 or 8 weeks. I had it for 2 hours before I walked straight into the Prime Minister's office, unannounced, put it down and said, we need to stop this. That was my actions then. If I'd had a copy of this, or if someone had shown it to me, I'm not too sure if I or my staff would have got to the person first to take it from them. And then if I'd read that, I suspect my actions would have been the same as what I did on the 7th of November as soon as I got the substantive brief from the Solicitor General.
I'm just going to put you the evidence of Mr French given to this commission as to what he said occurred at the 4th of July 2019 meeting, Mr Robert. He says that he brought with him a copy of the draft advice to the meeting, and he quoted directly from the advice at the meeting to raise verbally the need for a Solicitor General's opinion. So is it your evidence that you don't recall that occurring?
I don't, but of course, at the end of the meeting, my recollection is there was broad spread agreement we needed to get the Solicitor General opinion.
And he says that you said words to the effect to him that legal advice was really only an opinion until a court declares the law.
Well, again, I don't recall that, Mr Scott, but I again put it to the Commission. If I refer to the slides from the 4th of July, the ones where that errant page was, you know which page it's in, every deep diver department has, they produce the slides for it. If you go to those slides, you'll find nothing about the AGS advice in it. So not only did the Secretary Leon not cover it on the 27th of May, it was not covered in the Blue Book, It was not covered in Brief 119. It was not covered in Cabinet in Confidence Brief 120. It was not covered in the slides presented to me. Now, I don't recall it being briefed orally, but if the department had said, here is the AGS opinion, and it says that averaging is unlawful, I would have grabbed it and acted on it. More importantly, if I look at the PGPA Act, section 19(1)B, I think, it makes it very clear that secretaries withholding information that is material from ministers is an offence under that Act. So if the secretary knew that that existed and had not told me, then that offence may well be in play.
Can I, just for completeness, put this to you?
Yes, ma'am.
What the secretary said was that she thought she or a staff member would have told you or your office of the AGS advice orally back in June 2019, about the time of the Masterton brief, I think, because they did not want to put it in a written brief. So can you comment on that?
I don't recall that, and respectfully, Commissioner, I dispute that. The whole point of Brief 120 as Cabinet in Confidence is that it's Cabinet in Confidence. It can't be FOI'd, can't be shared, can't be leaked, can't be doing anything. It's the whole point of you have things in Cabinet deliberation. If the Secretary had a brief that made it clear that the entire premise of a $4.4 billion program that had been running for 2.5 years under her watch, at least 3.5 years for the government, that it was now unlawful, the fact that that would not be given to me in writing is simply unconscionable. And I've chosen my words carefully, ma'am. How could a brief like that not be given in writing?
Okay, I think you've answered the question. You dispute the evidence.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Given what you've just said, can you explain why an advice of the nature of the AGS advice on your evidence was not disclosed to you at this meeting?
No, I cannot. And I've since learned in the course of this proceedings it was not presented to the previous minister either. So there is a wider question, Mr Scott, if I may, as to why this advice in March wasn't presented to the previous minister as soon as it was received, was held over for the election, and then why the advice wasn't immediately put in writing to the new incoming minister. You could even ask the question why this wouldn't have been provided to the Attorney General.
Mr Robert, can I ask you to turn to your tab 24 of volume 1 of the bundles in front of you, exhibit 6284, doc ID SRO.001.001.0135.
Sorry, Mr Scott, you got ahead of me. Volume 1?
Yes, tab 24.
Tab 24. Which part, sir?
Well, I'll take you to it, but let's just identify it first. Do you agree with me that it's a transcript of an interview involving yourself and Laura Tingle on the ABC 7:30 program?
One doesn't tend to forget interviews with Laura Tyndall, Mr Scott.
I'm just going to ask you about the question and answer at the bottom of the page.
Page 1, sir?
Yes. So the question from Ms Tingle is, but the problem here is a more generic one about the robo-debt system, which is that people get assessments just saying you owe us X thousand dollars. It doesn't tell you when that debt may have been raised or what it relates to. Can you understand why people are perplexed and a bit angry about this? Do you agree with me that's a question that she asked you in this interview?
Indeed.
And that you responded, I certainly understand that, Laura. I always encourage people, if in doubt, contact the department. In the last 4 or 5 years, the department has recovered $1.9 billion in overpayments, and we have a legal responsibility to do that. So I guess it's a type of mutual obligation. People need to keep their affairs or their income assessments up to date. You know, using MyGov is one example, and of course we cross-check it with the ATO, and if there's a discrepancy notice is raised. And that's the legal requirement we've got. And if citizens just keep their income up to date, if there's any questions, contact the department. I think we can avoid many of these issues. Do you accept, Mr. Robert, that what you've said in response to that question from Ms. Tingle is inconsistent with the state of mind you assert you held at the conclusion of the deep dive session on the 4th of July 2019?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Keeping in mind, if I've got a personal opinion, my next step is to seek the appropriate advice. Until such time as that arrives, I remain a Cabinet Minister and am responsible for holding the Cabinet line, which is what I've done in the interview.
Well, it's one thing, I suggest, Mr. Robert, to be circumspect about a matter for which you've sought legal advice. I suggest it's quite another thing to represent a degree of confidence in the program that you appear to have represented in this interview.
Respectfully, Mr. Scott, ministers are required to defend the government's programs as part of Cabinet solidarity, regardless if they agree with them or not, as, by the way, is the public service. I've implemented many things that I passionately disagree with, but I'm still required as a minister to represent them and defend them. And that's what I've done here, regardless of my personal sense of belief.
Well, it's not just a question of personal sense of belief. On your state of mind that you assert existed from the 4th of July 2019, you had serious doubts about the lawfulness of this program.
Well, my view was the sole use could not be sufficient. It just can't. Partial I wasn't well versed on, only because government has a way of adding bits and pieces together to make a whole. The tax office was a master at this. But at the sole use, yes, not just misgivings, it couldn't possibly work.
Couldn't possibly work lawfully, do you mean?
Correct, what I would call sufficiently. But just because I have a reservation, respectfully, does not mean I'm going to go on Laura Tingle's program and say I think the government program is wrong.
Well, you might not do that, but you might not express the degree of confidence in the program that you purported to in this interview.
In every interview, government ministers are expected to show confidence in the agenda of the government. There is no other way that the Westminster system operates. Cabinet ministers can't go out and defend some parts of a government's program and be wishy-washy on others. That's just not how a government can operate, sir, respectfully.
All right, the next document I want to show you is behind your tab 25, Mr. Robert.
Sorry, what number, sir?
25. Exhibit 6285, Doc ID SRO.001.001.0136.
An interview with Mr. Spears?
Yes, on the 31st of July 2019. All right, I'm going to ask you about the transcript of this interview, in particular the passage that commences on the page with the last 4 digits of 0004. And in particular, do you see the passage towards the bottom of the page, your statement commencing with the words, well, as of now?
Yes.
And then the words can continue there. But remember, David, since 1 July 15, there's been 850,000 compliance reviews finalised. In 20% of those cases, the citizens have said, no, here's all of my facts, and they've said nothing to see here. In 80% of the cases, the debt's been raised, and in 99.2% of the cases, the debt is correct. I suggest to you, based on your state of mind that you assert you had on the 4th of July 2019, that was untrue.
Well, we now know the basis of raising debts, as the SC or the Solicitor General has informed us, is incorrect. So yes, that statement is untrue. But until such time as that advice came and the use of averaging was continuing, that statement was in line with that.
Well, your evidence was that you could not raise a debt based solely on averaging.
That was my belief, yes.
And in 90% of cases, that's exactly what was happening under the program, to your knowledge at the time.
Yes, that is correct.
So what you said there, to your knowledge at the time, was false.
To my personal view, yes, but I'm still a government minister and it's still a government program, and this was the approach that Cabinet has signed off on 3 or 4 years earlier and had been going on. And until such time as I'm not a lawyer, I've got a competent legal view. It is still just my opinion.
Doesn't mean you have to misrepresent the figures, though, and say 99.2% of cases produce an accurate debt.
That's the figures from the department, Commissioner, in terms of the way they were operating. That's their numbers. Their numbers, I believe, that I was using in the House of Representatives about the same time. These interviews, I think, came about because of questions in the House of Representatives.
Commissioner, I object. This is clearly
Oh, the numbers being used in the House. Yeah, stay off what you said in Parliament, if you wouldn't mind, because of parliamentary privilege.
Yes, ma'am.
But you're saying they were the departmental figures, but you knew they couldn't be right.
I had a massive personal misgiving, yes, but I'm still a Cabinet Minister.
Yeah, but it doesn't compel you to say things that you don't believe to be true, surely. It's one thing to stick to the policy and say this is how we do it and we're confident in the program, but to actually give statistics which you couldn't have believed to be accurate is another thing, isn't it?
They were the numbers from the department based on the working approach to how the program was being run. They were the accepted figures by government to use. And as a dutiful Cabinet Minister, ma'am, that's what we do.
Misrepresent things to the Australian public.
I wouldn't respectfully put it that way, because until such time, Commissioner, as I've got the legal opinion, I could be wrong. I'm not a lawyer, so my view may well be wrong. And having come from tax says black as white all the time. It's extraordinary what the tax office does on a commissioner declaration. So I've watched government do some extraordinary things. So I've got to leave room for the fact that I may well be wrong. The Solicitor General will determine the correct path, but until that time comes, I can't just give my personal opinion. I have got to continue to uphold the government policy.
This wasn't a matter of law, this was a matter of maths, really, and you could see that the maths could not be correct.
Well, the reason I used the extreme example, ma'am, to choose your words, of the $1 million was to try and stress test it. So in my view, the maths could not possibly add up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. The next document I want to show you, Mr Robert, is behind your tab 34. Doc ID CTH.3003.0001.1379, Exhibit 6318. Do you have that there, Mr Robert?
Yes, sir.
Do you agree with me that's a transcript of a doorstop you did on the 17th of September 2019?
Yes, notwithstanding my name spelled incorrectly, but let's say yes.
Yes. Hopefully you won't attribute that misspelling to me. But do you agree with me that the doorstop that's being transcribed here is in reference to a class action that was being launched with an announcement involving Mr Shorten?
Yes, my understanding is Gordon Legal had flown from from Melbourne to Canberra to do a press conference with Mr Shorten just prior to question time.
Okay. And you open the doorstop by describing the class action as a political stunt?
I did. No case lodged, no papers, no plaintiffs, flown to Canberra, Labor lawyers with Bill Shorten before question time, and in their press conference they said it was a legitimate political strategy. On the basis of that, I think stunt is probably the apt term.
This is the class action that the Commonwealth ultimately settled in the matter of Bregodettes,
That is correct?
on the basis that the Commonwealth ultimately conceded that averaging was unlawful.
That's right, on the basis of the Solicitor General advice I'd asked for on the 4th of July.
Okay. And if we go to the second page of the document, last 4 digits, 1380, you're quoted in response to a question, do you concede that there is a high percentage of people who have been robo-debted, if I can use that word, where those claims were incorrect from the government? Do you see that?
I do.
And your response was, not at all. We know there's been 850,000 Australians where the department has gone forward to say that the income that you declared to Centrelink on the left hand does not match your tax return on the right hand. Can you please explain it? 20% of those have adequately explained it. Of the remainder, 0.8% have been overturned on appeal. That's a 99.2% effectiveness rate for those who cannot explain why what they reported to Centrelink does not equal what they told the ATO on their tax returns. Do you accept from me, sorry, I'll withdraw that, I'll rephrase. Do you accept that your assertion of a 99.2% effectiveness rate, based on the state of mind that you say you arrived at on the 4th of July 2019, was false?
I do accept that now. But again, Mr Scott, as I said to the Commissioner, I am still at this stage a Cabinet Minister. I'm still required to uphold, until such time as I'm advised lawfully otherwise, the requirement for the government program. I still have to defend it. That is the job I've got.
Despite what you knew to be the case, which is that you could not lawfully rely on income averaging as a sole basis to calculate and raise a debt.
Well, despite what I thought was the case, noting I'm not a lawyer, and noting I've seen government turn black to white in the ATO before, whilst I couldn't reconcile the numbers, it doesn't mean I couldn't be wrong. And until such time as I've got the advice, respectfully, Mr Scott, I have no choice as a Cabinet Minister but to defend government policy.
Can I just ask you about this figure? Is that where the 99.2% accuracy rate comes from, the notion that only 0.8% had been overturned on appeal to the AAT?
Ostensibly, yes.
Okay.
That, and there'll be a whole range of other extenuating circumstances that might come up that vary.
Sorry, I don't understand.
In terms of 99.2% effectiveness for those who can't explain what they've reported, there'll be some cases in the AAT, there'll be some cases where there may have been an error by the department or an error by tax that may be picked up.
So what takes out the 0.8%? They've succeeded in the AAT, or the department of its own volition has said?
Yes, or they've found an error, or on review prior to the AAT they've had a look at it. There'll be any number of these vagaries.
It's really hard to credit that it was only 0.8%.
That's the challenge and the problem of using averaging. Because only 10% of people were engaging with the department, the department then simply got the ATO data, washed it through and said, voila, you've earned $1 million for the year. That's why the extreme example is actually quite a germane one to truly grasp what averaging does.
Look, on a bigger picture, you weren't the minister the whole time, but the government somehow has allowed this program to run in full flight since September 2016 on such flimsy premises. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yes, ma'am. The premises are flimsy and they should have been questioned. Advice should have been provided. There were numerous instances where my legal team have shown through the Royal Commission where there are opportunities for legal advice to be asked and received. I still remain flabbergasted, I think, that on the 27th of May briefing, the Blue Book, Brief 119, Brief 120, Cabinet in Confidence, this AGS advice was not provided. If it had been provided and someone had walked in, I would have walked it straight to the Prime Minister.
But what about the ministers? They never had any responsibility to say, A, this just doesn't seem arithmetically sound, and B, what's the law?
Ministers are responsible and accountable for administering their department. I was. So I'm accountable for everything that my department did. And I'd like to think that I acted as soon as I found out.
All right, but do you take any responsibility for what the government of which you were part did?
Oh, absolutely, Commissioner. As a senior member of the government, I take absolute responsibility as part of Cabinet solidarity for this. But I also take responsibility for being the minister that called it out to say we've got to get advice and stop it. Now, I'd like to think that between when I asked on the 4th of July and when I got the advice on the 6th of November, that would have been shorter. I didn't think for a second that it would take a month for my department to agree what the wording is with the Solicitor General, and that may be naivety on my behalf. And I didn't think my department would spend 7 weeks holding the information up before they got it to me. If I'd perhaps known that would be that long, I may have done something to shorten it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr Robert, can you please turn to your tab 35, doc ID ACS.9999.0001.0106_R, Exhibit 2948.
Is this where it says Cass and I met with Minister Robert?
Yes,
That would be ACOS, is it?
yes,
So this is an ACOS file note, is it?
yes.
Yep.
Now, this is a meeting on the 14th of October, file note of a meeting on the 14th of October 2019. See that?
I do.
Do you recall meeting with ACOS representatives on or about that date?
I would have. It's ACOS mostly is policy, so they meet with Minister Ruston, but as a general rule, I meet with anyone once.
Okay. I'll just call out the second and third paragraphs, please. Now, do you have a recollection on or about the 14th of October 2019 of a meeting where ACOS representatives expressed concerns with the use of averaging in the Robo-Debt scheme?
Not vividly, but this wouldn't surprise me. This is how they would present themselves, so I don't dispute what they've put here.
Okay, and you accept that you said words to the effect that's recorded in the passages that are called out on the screen?
I don't recall at all, Mr Scott. If I could make a comment upon it, I would have treated this, it's ACOS, which means they would leak whatever is said straight away. I would have treated this as any media interview in that I would have held the government line.
Right, including saying you didn't think there was anything wrong with Robo-Debt as there was a duty to collect overpayments.
I can't recall the words I said, Mr Scott, but I would have defended the program in line with media interviews I'd done previously.
Including saying you didn't think there was anything wrong with reversing the onus of proof.
Again, Mr Scott, I don't recall it, but I would have defended the government.
Okay. And again, I suggest to you that's inconsistent with the state of mind you say you'd formed on the 4th of July 2019.
I agree with you, but again, for consistency, Mr Scott, I'd say to you, as a Cabinet Minister, I don't get to choose the policies I agree with or don't agree with.
Do you think you said that people were better placed than Centrelink to get information from employers and banks and so on?
As a general rule, they are, Commissioner. One of the challenges is people don't keep their data up to date. For example, if you go to the Medicare system now, 2 million addresses will be out of date.
Okay, you may be wandering a little. I'm just asking if you said this.
Yes, I actually believe that people are the best place to update their information because they know which bank accounts they've got or which employers they're working with.
Yes, but Centrelink certainly knew which employers because that was the data it was operating off.
They would have got the tax data, yes.
All right.
Thank you, Commissioner. I next want to show you document behind tab 40, doc ID CTH.3035.0021.9581, exhibit 6290.
SG opinion, yes.
Yes. Of course, you recognise this document, Mr Robert, correct?
I do, because I took it with me to see the Prime Minister on the night of the 7th.
And your evidence is that your office was not provided that document until the 6th of November 2019?
That is correct. That's when it entered the office.
Is it your evidence that you weren't informed of the substance of it before that date?
I don't believe so. I note Ms Leon saying that she put a phone call through to me on the 29th. I don't recall that.
I need to put her version of events to you for your response, Mr. Robert. She says, and has said to this commission, that she phoned you on the 29th of October 2019, informed you about the advice, in particular that as a result of the advice it is not permissible to raise debts based on averaging income. We have held this advice very close due to its sensitivity. DSS is not yet aware of it. We'll be preparing a briefing to you to inform the Prime Minister. Due to the timeframes in the Amato proceeding, we will need to act fairly swiftly to cease the averaging of income. The Department needs to take action in relation to the program and its ongoing operation. Do you have a recollection of, on or about the 29th of October 2019, Ms Leon informing you of matters to that effect?
I don't recall that. I didn't make a note in my diary. I'm a prolific diarist in that respect. My actions, if you look when this arrived on the 6th, I arrived into Canberra on the 7th. The department had had it for almost 6 to 8 weeks. I had it for 2 hours and walked straight into the Prime Minister's office to put a stop to it. My contention to you, sir, would be if the phone call had gone like that said this is unlawful, I would have acted straight away.
Okay. I have to put the final part of what she says
Yes, sir.
to you. She says that you said words to the effect, legal advice is just advice.
Well, considering I'm the one who asked for it on the 4th of July, my staff chased it up. When it arrived within hours, not 8 weeks that my department had or my secretary had, within hours I walked into the Prime Minister's office to put an end to it and asked for an urgent ERC meeting which occurred the following week. So I think my actions go to my state of mind.
Can you please go to your tab 55, Mr. Robert, volume 2, exhibit 4263, doc ID CTH.4000.0070.266, sorry, .2611.
$55, 2611 is the last 4 letters, Mr. Scott?
Beg your pardon?
2611, sir, are they the last 4?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, do you recognise this document, Mr. Robert?
Yes, there were 2 documents to my recollection that arrived, 372 and I think 365.
All right. And is it your evidence that the date next to your signature on the first page of 6 November 2019 is an error?
Yeah, it would have been the 7th, I suspect, only because I wasn't in Canberra on the 6th. I arrived on the 7th.
Okay. And do you agree with me it's a brief to you about the Solicitor General's advice, the risks associated with continuing to administer the program in its then current form in light of that advice, and that the department will attempt to resolve the current litigation by way of consent orders?
Yes, I accept it says all that.
And on the second page, do you see that paragraph 3 identifies the critical conclusion from the Solicitor General's advice?
Yes.
And that paragraph 4, the department had not identified any errors in the opinion with which to re-engage the Solicitor General?
Correct. I made extensive notes in my diary on this.
And then under the heading Impact on Program, Paragraph 7 commences with, whilst noting that the opinion does not amount to a judicial declaration of law. Do you see that?
I do.
Can you assist us as to why it would be necessary for you to be informed of what is a reasonably obvious proposition that the opinion did not amount to a judicial declaration of law?
Don't understand the question, Mr. Scott, sorry.
Well, you knew it didn't amount to a judicial declaration of law, didn't you?
I had a very strong view that the numbers don't add up. I'm not a lawyer, but if the numbers don't add up, they don't add up.
Sure, but
But I can't walk into Cabinet, sir, respectfully, and go, your numbers don't add up on a program you've been running for 4 years. But I can walk in with the second highest law officer of the land saying there is a substantial problem and this needs to stop.
just on the strength of that,
Second highest law officer in the land, Mr. Scott, absolutely. The only higher than that is the Attorney General himself.
with no further inquiry?
No. From whom do you seek further inquiry than the Solicitor General, apart from the Attorney General?
And is it your evidence that from the moment you received this, you were informed of this advice on the 6th of November 2019, you accepted the opinion of the Solicitor General?
I did, and the facts speak to it. Within hours, I walked straight into the Prime Minister's office, presented it to him, talked it through, asked for an immediate ERC as quickly as possible, which was granted, and said that we need to stop the use of averaging, all of which I informed the Secretary the next day. So my actions speak to how seriously I took this and exactly what I did. If I can compare actions, Mr. Scott, if you'd permit me, my department had this for 6 or 7 weeks, and I get a brief that goes through, here's all the issues the Secretary's got. They have spent weeks and weeks working out the liability the Secretary had before they gave this to government, noting they had the AGS advice that they did not give to me or to government. Within 2 hours, I acted. And that should give you a view as to the strength to which I held the view of the second highest law officer in the land.
By way of the liability issues of the Secretary that you're referring to, are those issues identified in paragraph 8?
They are.
See, one view of the evidence, Mr. Robert, is that the department thought it necessary to identify those issues because the Secretary needed to convince you to end the program because the Secretary perceived a lack of support from you in respect of that course.
I completely reject that, Mr. Scott, strongest possible terms. I asked for the advice on the 4th of July. I wanted it. My department took months and months to get it to me, and when they had it, they ostensibly sat on it for 6 weeks to work through what to do. And then as soon as I got it, I demonstrated the seriousness by walking straight into the Prime Minister's office. I'd also put it to you, sir, respectfully, that
You
on the
don't
27th...
have to put things to Mr Scott.
Oh, sorry, ma'am.
He's not your adversary, he's just asking questions.
Yes, ma'am. I'll also like to state, if that's appropriate,
Sure.
That if that AGS advice had been presented to me on the 27th of May or in brief 119 or brief 120 at any of those opportunities, then that could have, or this issue could have been resolved earlier.
You describe what you did in response to this brief. May we take it in paragraph 84 of your statement on pages 26 and 27?
Sorry, what paragraph, sir?
Paragraph 84.
That is correct.
Including visiting the Prime Minister's office to personally discuss the Solicitor General's opinion with him.
That is correct.
With a view to a ERC meeting being urgently brought forward.
I needed an appropriate form of government, which ERC, as a formulated committee of cabinet, will have the authority to sort this out.
Okay.
And it had a massive impost on expenditure to the Commonwealth. Therefore, it had to go to ERC before it went to any other form of cabinet.
Okay. And you say in paragraph 86 of your statement that you met with the Secretary on the 8th of November 2019?
The next day, that's correct.
At the conclusion of the meeting, you instructed her to cease the use of ATO averaged income data as the sole or partial trigger for raising a welfare debt?
Correct. I explained to her the discussion with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister agreed. We're going to ERC to resolve, but with the Solicitor General having said quite definitively, therefore, we needed to act.
Okay. I'm going to put to you her version of that discussion. Her version is that she said to you, in reference to the opinion, the best course is to apologise to our customers, to admit the error and to inform customers and staff of the steps we will take to correct the error. And you responded with words to the effect, we will absolutely not be doing that, we will double down. What do you say?
I don't recall that, Mr Scott, and would be completely inconsistent with the fact that I've got the Solicitor General's advice I wanted. I've taken it to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's agreed to an urgent ERC. He's agreed to ceasing averaging solely and partially. That he wanted to look at further proof points, and the Cabinet deliberations from there also look at what those further proof points would be. I would have relayed that to the Secretary. The idea, somewhat farcically, Mr Scott, if I may, that I'd come out of the Prime Minister's office, who's agreed with the Solicitor General's view, agreed to an urgent ERC the next week, that I would then ignore those two and say we're going to double down on the same project, doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay. I'm going to ask you about what you said earlier about the Solicitor General's opinion itself being sufficient to be accepted without any further inquiry. Paragraph 88 of your statement, you refer to the ERC meeting on the 12th of November 2019 and being in the Cabinet ante-room where you say you gave the Attorney-General an overview of the SG opinion and the Owen's opinion and asked him whether as First Law Officer he agreed with the views of the Solicitor-General, and the Attorney-General responded that he did. I suggest to you that's inconsistent with your evidence that you accepted the Solicitor-General's opinion without further inquiry.
If I may, Mr Scott, ERC was set for the 12th. At this stage, the Cabinet Secretary walked out of the room to say they'd run out of time and the ERC meeting to talk about this would be moved to the 13th. We were all waiting in the ante-room. It wasn't a meeting per se, that's just where you wait to go into the Cabinet room. At this stage, I took the opportunity, now that we're delayed by 24 hours, to put it to the Attorney-General, and I called him Attorney, not Christian, so it was very clear to everyone in the room, the First Law Officer, do you agree with the Second Law Officer? And he said yes. At that point, I turned around to the assembled secretaries and made it very clear. The First Law Officer has now spoken. Obviously, the Prime Minister has now agreed. We don't have an ERC decision. We'll have that tomorrow. But this is enough in terms of the Prime Minister and the Attorney-General now and myself saying this finishes. So yes, we'd have an ERC, but the most substantial law officers, being the Prime Minister and the Attorney-General, have now spoken. It was a result of having the ERC moved to the following day. If the ERC had gone that day, no problem. The Attorney-General would have been in the room and he would have given his view in the room, and the same decision of the 13th would have happened on the 12th. But I wasn't prepared to wait that extra day.
I suggest to you, Mr Robert, that your description of what you said to the Attorney-General in paragraph 88 is inconsistent with you having, prior to that moment, accepted as correct the Solicitor-General's opinion.
And as I've just said to you, Mr Scott, I reject that statement you've just made. The reason why I asked him was because the ERC meeting had been postponed to the following day and I didn't want to postpone it. I'd already had a letter written to Secretary Leon that I put into evidence dated the 12th of November. I wanted to get that out and get that moving. And the easiest way, short of an ERC decision, was for the First Law Officer to speak so he could be heard.
Okay. But in any event, is it the position that after that meeting on the 12th of November 2019 that the position of the government was settled that averaging could not be used as a sole basis to raise debts?
The position of government is settled once ERC on behalf of Cabinet has settled it on the 13th, but at this stage now the Prime Minister and the First Law Officer, the Attorney General, had also agreed with the Solicitor General, and that was enough to give substantial instruction a second time. Whilst I'd already given it on the 8th that we are to cease. Secretary Campbell was also there. It was very clear now, the Attorney General had spoken, but the 13th of November is when the government decision was officially made.
So that's when the position was settled, the 13th.
The position was settled on the 13th.
Could I ask you, Mr. Robert, to turn to your pay tab 61 in volume 2? Exhibit 6296, doc ID SRO.001.001.0141.
National Press Club speech.
Yes. On the 14th of November 2019. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Robert, about the passage from the transcript of that appearance, commencing on the page with the last 4 digits of 0017. Do you see there that the transcript reveals that there is a question from, at the bottom of the page, from Mr. Karp of The Guardian?
Yes.
Refers to the Robodebt program and comments by former senior AAT member Mr. Carney that Robodebts are illegal because you can't calculate a debt based on estimates of income. And he cites as evidence the fact that when welfare recipients appeal debts and appeal adverse AAT decisions, Centrelink folds its tent, it waives the debt and it refuses to fight the issue in court. So could I please ask if you're confident that the debts are legal? Why has Centrelink never defended them in court? You see that question from Mr. Karp?
Yes, I do.
And your response goes over the page. You initially say, I've never been asked by an NDIS participant about income compliance. The next page, you're then pressed by Ms. Lane to answer. And then you say, okay, I'll answer if you like. Almost 1 million Australians own $5 billion in debts, and Mr. Shorten made the point during the election campaign that no one gets a leave pass from that. So we have an absolute responsibility, including a legislative responsibility to collect debts. We have a responsibility to ensure that people who earn a fortnightly income, who receive a fortnightly payment, that payment is appropriate and that their income that they are reporting to the Commonwealth is actually real and tangible. So using averaging as the basis to say to a citizen there may be a debt, can you please engage with us, is entirely appropriate. And that process of averaging using ATO tax receipts to say to Australians that there may be a problem, please engage with us, is absolutely appropriate, and we have a responsibility to do that. you agree with me that the truthful response to the questions from the members of the press gallery at that point in time would have been to acknowledge that the government had reached the point where averaging was unlawful?
It may well be truthful, Mr Scott, but I wasn't permitted to. So, if I may, the ERC made it very, very clear that any public announcement was to be agreed. I'm just reading my diary now. Announcement to agree with the Prime Minister, Treasurer, Minister for Finance and the Attorney General. I needed 4 senior ministers to agree with me before I said anything. So whilst I accept the contention that it had been resolved on the 13th, I did not have approval to make any statement. So I've answered Mr Karp's question very, very carefully, not to talk about the use of averaging.
But you've actually said that using averaging is entirely appropriate, and you could not have thought that for a minute, and you didn't need to say it.
With respect, Commissioner, if I may, I've said using averaging as the basis to say to a citizen, there may be a debt, please engage with us. At no point in this answer did I say use of averaging to crystallise the debt. I kept my words very tight because I knew the decision had been made. I knew I could not communicate anything about it. I'm asked a question, so I'm in a hell of a position now where I know what government's done, but I can't communicate it. So I've got to answer in no less a forum than the National Press Club in a way that says something and says nothing. It's a dreadful place for a minister to ever be in. That's why I tried to deflect at first, but Sabra Lane didn't let me.
Mr Robert, are you having reference to your phone during the course of your...
I needed to bring up my diary. I can show it to you if you like, only because I didn't know where my diary entry was in this great stack of books.
I suppose it's a form of note,
Yes, Commissioner.
as long as you don't
Is that not
text
appropriate?
anybody in the process.
Oh, no, I'm happy to show it to anyone, and I'm happy to not do it. I just didn't know where I'd find my journal
Okay,
entry.
just let us know if you need to refer to it.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
And so we know what you're
I
doing.
apologise, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner, would it be convenient to take the morning break?
Yeah, it would. We will come back at 25 to.
All rise. The Commission stands adjourned until 11:35.